Hello, I'm John. Welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm joined today by one of our writers, Ross Kane, who has written one of our July cover stories called A Church Politics of Non-Domination. So we are going to be talking about that article and its themes. But before we do, Ross, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm real glad to be with you today. I am a professor at Virginia Theological Seminary, which is a seminary of the Episcopal Church. We're based in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. And I write about ethics and culture, especially. And I also come from a background of working internationally with the Anglican Communion.
Excellent. Well, so glad you could join us today on the channel. This article, which I think has broad appeal, themes that are relevant to Christian folks of all traditions, but really focuses on some of the dynamics inside the Anglican Communion, the United Methodist Church. These are not the traditions I'm a part of. And so I think it might be helpful for some of our readers out there or listeners if you could tell us about the problem that kind of inspired this article. This, you talk about a tension, real or perceived, between the desire to be anti-colonial, but also the desire to be pro-LGBTQ. Can you explain why those things often come across in tension with each other in these traditions?
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak from my own tradition, though there are a lot of parallels within Methodism. Within the Anglican Communion, many bishops in the global South and other church leaders have very publicly said that the way that liberals in the Episcopal Church um, advocated for LGBTQ inclusion had all kinds of colonial rhetoric behind it. And it was just very surprising, I think, to most American Episcopalians. And I think what was interesting to me, you know, I had worked overseas with the Episcopal Church in South Sudan right after college for a couple of years. And it didn't seem surprising at all to me that these bishops were saying that, even though I myself was, I'm pro LGBTQ and was then too. But so, it became a really it made the politics really fraught. And I think it left a lot of liberal Episcopalians just kind of flat footed because we're like, well, of course we're anti colonial. Like, why would we, how could, and I think in an intuitive sense, we said, well, how can we be like pro queer and colonial at the same time? Like, isn't this like we're kind of pushing for the same values of inclusion and so forth? So, that rhetoric didn't really make any sense. But then when you sort of dig underneath a little bit, you do see that some of the liberal rhetoric did depend on a certain understanding of progress that's very based in a sort of Western sense of, other cultures will one day look like our culture. And there were all these things that for an African Christian really resonated with the experience of colonialism. Just this time it was about LGBTQ inclusion. And it's a tension that liberal Episcopalians have been living with, honestly, for like 20 or more years. And it just seemed like there wasn't really a strong paradigm that had been thrown out there to ground us as we kind of like respond to, bishops in the global South who were saying this to us.
Yeah. So in the article, you suggest there are paradigms out there, or at least one that could be helpful in moving forward in both of these areas. And the way that you describe it is non-domination and rather than domination. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about this paradigm or this framework. What are you thinking of when you're thinking of churches and their politics embracing non-domination?
Yeah. So kind of to start with the domination side, it's a theme in Christian theology that goes back at least to Augustine. It's saying that like one of the ways that humans distance ourselves from God's desire of love and justice for humans and the wider world is through dominating other people and dominating creation itself, right? So and that domination looks like all sorts of different things, but at the core of it, it's some people really saying who other people are without their input, participation, whatever. Um, they're basically, one person says what another person's identity is without that person having any say. And that's kind of a simple way to put it. And you can check out the article, for to go in a little more depth. Um, but that's what colonialism is. That's what racism is. That's what homophobia is, and ableism, and all these other things, right, are based in some people saying without other people saying who they are. And the writers from, I think, the New Testament on and before the New Testament too, give us a way of framing life together that looks different than that, right? And so one of the contrasts throughout the article is this politics of domination versus a politics of interdependence. And and in interdependence, it's only through one another that we can say who somebody else is. So, like, for me as a straight cisgendered white guy, like, for me to understand who somebody else is, it's not for me to say who they are. It's for me to listen and to receive and to hear other people's struggles against domination, and have that, and for my sense of identity and my sense of what's right for God's kingdom in the world, um, entails me being interdependent with them and understanding their own experience and their own struggles. And this theme of interdependence is all over the New Testament, right? I mean, it's in John, especially when Jesus is talking about the vine and the branches, and this deep dependence that we all share in one another and in God. And then in Paul, there's all this imagery in Paul about the body of Christ, and the body is this interdependent thing, and Christ is the head, but all the members actually need one another. And so, in a sense, like, the body of Christ in Paul is this body of non-domination, because Christ is the head and Christ himself doesn't dominate, right? So that seemed a kind of orienting center that can guide a different kind of church politics, a church politics that builds up interdependence and says, no, we don't get to say who other people are, but we define ourselves, like, mutually with one another.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. You give some, I thought, fascinating examples of what it can look like when domination is present within church politics at a structural level. And again, at not being part of the particular structures that you described, this was eye-opening. You talked about the Archbishop of Canterbury being the leader of the Anglican Communion, always there, located in the UK, even though it's a global communion. You talked about how at a lot of these denominations' global gatherings, these very Western parliamentary rules are always used to organize and run the meetings. Um, I was just curious about this idea of change at a systemic level, and anything you wanted to say further on this, whether it's more examples of how domination can be present, or maybe some hope you have for how change might come about for more interdependence and mutuality.
Yeah, sure. One of the things I say in the article is that, liberal Episcopalians and Methodists alike, I think we can be more political and less partisan. It's really easy in the Episcopal Church, to speak from my own tradition, for folks to say, "Hey, this bishop in Africa is against same-sex marriage, so I'm not going to work with that bishop on anything." But the truth is, like, I know a lot of those bishops, and I know that they're actually also working very hard to fight anti-Black racism in the Anglican Communion. So I think that we should be in alliance with them when it comes to fighting anti-Black racism, and be in alliance with other people when it comes to fighting um, against LGBTQ domination. So I think that there's a reason Jesus said, "Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves," right? I mean, I think we can be um, adaptive in the way that we relate with folks in other parts of the communion, but it's easy for us just to think, okay, this bishop thinks this way on this issue, so he must think this way on all these other issues, and that's just simply not the case. I mean, in the article, just to share an anecdote, I share how It was a Southern Sudanese pastor who changed my mind in the early 2000s on LGBTQ inclusion. Gene Robinson had just been elected a bishop in the Episcopal Church, the first openly gay bishop in our church. And the bishop asked me what I thought about it. And, I sort of rehearsed all these arguments, saying, all right, I think we need more time and these sorts of things that really just reflected my own uncertainty on the issue. And I remember he said, Ross, I'm just afraid the church is going to be on the wrong side of oppression one more time. And like, I just knew right then, I was like, I can't see this issue the same way now. Because this pastor had lived through profound oppression in his homeland in South Sudan and understood it and understood domination all too well. So, that's just an anecdote that shows the kind of work that can happen when we are committed to working with folks who we don't completely agree with on everything. And we find that, maybe in time we'll persuade them on some of our issues, as we're, for example, fighting against anti-Black racism and Anglicanism or Methodism. Maybe we'll change their minds on LGBTQ issues. Maybe they'll change our minds about how our economies are structured and how our Western U.S. economy is so extractive on so many communities in Africa and other places in the global South. Maybe it'll change our economics and our economic politics. But and I think to get back to your question, that longer term vision is a hope that we can not be held back by the fact that the global growth of the church um, has been entwined with colonialism. I mean that is the case. I mean, I think that's pretty historically established at this point. That's been the past, but it doesn't have to be the future. We can form these global bodies where it doesn't matter where we meet. We can't just assume that like we're going to meet in Western Europe because the flights are cheaper to get there. We should have meetings in all sorts of places so that we can genuinely encounter one another, not always on our terms, but often on theirs, and that's what can ultimately make for a more interdependent church that looks more like the body of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about this stuff. I'm sure there's so much more we could chat about, but this is a lot to think about. Anyone out there who didn't get a chance to read this article yet, there'll be a link to the essay below in the video description, along with some other links where you can go read Ross's Substack, check out his book. The book is The Good News of Church Politics. It was recently published. Ross, thanks so much for chatting today.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you.